Hello, guys. It's Adina. And right now, the podcast is on pause. I'm taking a pause from August through the end of September to focus on family time, travel, self care, and to tweak a few things with the podcast. In the meantime, you may want to catch up on episodes 1 through 105 or re listen to a few of your favorites. Don't forget to sign up for the Atheists in Recovery newsletter, and you can find the link in the show notes below. And we talk about many things in the newsletter, from my favorite books and movies and journal articles on all things related to the podcast. Sometimes they're not related, but also interesting things. We talk about journaling and relationships and how to nourish your soul. Or maybe you're interested in starting a journaling practice, and there are ways for you to do that by subscribing to the newsletter, perhaps even liberating yourself from some of these defeating narratives. Journaling will help you do that as well. Okay, well, I will see you soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hola, Atheists in Recovery land, and welcome to episode 79 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today we have a guest episode for you. I haven't recorded one of these in a while, and I was excited to have Derek on. And so today we are talking about how to reset your recovery in the new year. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, Adina, I don't need another resolutions podcast and a goal-setting podcast. But I think that Derek and I were pretty clear from the get-go that this is not a new year, new you kind of episode. This really is maybe going through the tools that are working for you and continuing with them, or refreshing them, or maybe it's just accepting where you are in your recovery and knowing that whatever journey you decide to go on, whether it's, you put down the bottle, or maybe you picked it up recently and now you're starting anew, to make sure that you are giving yourself some grace, that everything that you do is a continuation of where you want to go. Well, that's the goal anyway, is to line up with your morals and your values and make sure that you are being kind to yourself as you go through this journey. And so Derek and I talk about routines. Yes, we definitely do, but we also talk about connection, and we talk about how to position yourself to make positive changes every day. And Derek gets a little bit granular when talking about his family. And, he says that many of his immediate family members died from complications from alcohol abuse. And people always ask him, well, didn't that drive you into recovery? And he says, no. If anything, that made him go even deeper into his addiction. And so hearing him talk about that hopefully will help a lot of individuals who are in the depths of depression, and knowing that there are always people there that want to help. And so before we get to Derek's story, I also want to let you know that there is a trigger warning with this episode. And so I want to give you again the National Suicide Prevention Hotline number, which is 1-800-273-8255. And you'll find that number in the show notes. But again, please know that there is always help available. It's just a phone call away. Okay. On to Derek. Derek Thatcher. Through a myriad of jobs and life experiences, Derek found that the commonality between all of these was that he enjoys helping people. His current role as an alumni program lead for Newport Academy grants him the ability to help and support teens in their recovery every day. After graduating from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2013 with a bachelor's in psychology and a minor in Black studies, he spent 2 years traveling in New Zealand and Argentina. Derek is in the last semester of his substance abuse counseling certification program at Northern Virginia Community College, and he intends to pursue his master's in counseling. All right, guys, on to the show. Derek Thatcher, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Adina.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk about our recovery journey at the start of the new year. But before we get to resetting our recovery, I was wondering if you could tell the listeners a little bit more about maybe your deepest roots from childhood.
Sure, absolutely. My grandfather was a Methodist minister. So, on that side of my family, there was some heavy religious influences. My father, he fought in Vietnam, and after that, he held some disdain for religion. So it was this kind of interesting dynamic where I would go to church on Sundays with my mom, and my dad would stay home. And I grew up on a 40-acre farm in West Virginia. And
wow.
Yeah, it was a wonderful childhood. And I never really thought about church in that spiritual sense. It was just someplace I went and saw my friends. The woods, the creek, the pond, the wildlife, that was my church. That was my spiritual place of belonging. And I think that's really what I've carried with me into my adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just that connection with nature has really helped you spiritually or otherwise, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. My morning routine, and I'll talk about this a little more in depth as we proceed, but I sit out in nature when I walk my dog. I find a quiet spot in the woods and I sit down and I do a little bit of reflection and meditation before I go and start my day, and everything gets crazy, and that's my safe space.
Yeah. I can't wait to get to learn more about your routine. I think that this podcast partly was started because I wanted to know more about people's routines that were successful in recovery. And so this episode is right up my alley. So I wonder if we can switch gears for a minute and you could tell me a little bit about your recovery journey.
Sure, absolutely. I like to leave out most of the gory details, but I was in active addiction for 10 years, around there. I started using and all sorts of types of things when I was 17, and that continued until I was 29. So, a little over 10 years. And I did well. I made it through for a while. I made it through college with a good GPA, and I traveled abroad. I lived in New Zealand for a year. I lived in Argentina for a year, and my addiction followed me wherever I went. It was always my go-to coping mechanism. And, in my mid-20s, it was no longer sustainable. Things began to fall apart in my life. I was losing jobs. I was losing friends. I was losing my own mental capacity. I wasn't the person that I strived to be. And it created a lot of cognitive dissonance, this feeling where my actions didn't align with my beliefs. And a little bit after that, my oldest brother passed away from Korsakoff syndrome, which is alcohol-induced dementia.
Oh, wow.
Which is pretty rare for someone who is his age.
How old was he?
He was 45. And I guess it was 2 years after that, my father passed away from cirrhosis of the liver. And I was in active addiction, but I put him through hospice, helped take care of him. And a year after that, 8 months later, my mother passed away from cirrhosis of the liver.
Wow.
So this runs really heavy in my blood.
Yeah.
And, it's difficult to separate the environmental and the genetic factors, but I went through some heavy, heavy grief. You know, a lot of people ask me, did you get sober because all these people passed away? And I said, no, you know, it threw me into a deeper state of depression, more isolation. And my addiction got worse. And right around Christmas of 2019, I tried to take my own life. I woke up the next day and I called a rehab center. And it was the first time, it wasn't the first time I'd been to rehab, but it was the first time that I put myself there.
Right. Makes a difference.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I was ready to change and I put the work in this time. Haven't stopped doing it since. And so this last Christmas Eve, I celebrated my 1 year.
Congrats.
Thank you. And, you know, and I'm still what most would refer to as early in recovery. So I think that gives me a unique perspective. The pain is not so far away.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. If you could pull out maybe one or two tools that really helped you to get and stay sober, what would those things be? What would those tools be?
I think routine. I'll talk about it over and over again. It's been something that's added structure to my life. So, you know, having my days scheduled, there's no surprises. I mean, there's not no surprises, but I always have something to do. I don't have a lot of that down bored time where my mind gets to wander. And so I think that's been a huge part of my recovery, is keeping busy. And then I think my other tool would be reaching out. I learned how to ask for help.
Yeah. And I think that's so important, Derek. And I wonder if you could even talk a little bit about this feeling of when you're low and you're so down, sort of like in this sort of hole I picture. It's really hard to ask for help. It's almost like you feel like, there's obviously there's this shame component to it. How do you kind of overcome that?
It's a great question. You know, I remember being in that hole. It's not just the shame. It's also, you feel like you're a burden on other people. And that's a really tough hurdle to get over. And I've been in and out of programs, and I really don't align with anyone specifically, but through either sponsorship or the people in my life that I look up to, I consider my mentors. I don't have a sponsor, but I have mentors. Talking with them regularly, I think that was the biggest thing. Because when I was okay, I could talk to them. And it was getting into the habit, creating this habit of speaking to them on a sometimes daily basis, where when I wasn't okay, it wasn't so hard to pick up that phone anymore.
So making it part of your routine, like you'd said earlier, was really helpful.
Yeah, I think everything goes back to that. But yeah, I mean, forming a habit, and they say it takes 66 days to create a habit, and asking for help, reaching out for help can fall right in line with becoming a habit.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about this idea of mentors, and how did you decide to go this route versus some of the more traditional routes?
I'm still in counseling. You know, I see a therapist less regularly than I used to, but I consider him a mentor. And I got, one of the very first things I did after I got out of inpatient was I found a grief counseling service.
Nice.
Here in Virginia called Haven. And they're free. It's, you know, they're grief support specialists. It's all a free service they offer. And my mentor from there has been an enormous help in confronting and moving on that grief spectrum towards it. And as far as straying from the traditional 12-step program, I had a really hard time with the dogma and the G word, God. It never resonated with me. And there are lots of people in those programs who their God is whatever they want it to be. But I wanted something tangible. I wanted something that I could feel and touch and have a conversation with. And I found that in mentors, in people.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that idea of mentors because, they could be, any shape, size, color, they don't have to be in the addiction community, and you can gain a lot from just different perspectives. So I really liked that. When you first told me about that, I was like, oh, this is interesting. I need to ask him more about this. Yeah. So perhaps now we can talk a little bit more about resetting your recovery. And so we're recording this in January, and there's a lot of focus on resets. I get a lot of emails about resetting. And it can be sort of tied to resolutions, which I know is sort of a dirty word, but it doesn't have to be. And I thought maybe you could come on and talk